The blood-red sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty trail where Rosalind Lawson trudged forward, her shoulders bent beneath the weight of the wooden cross she carried. Her boots were worn thin, her dress tattered and stained with the dust of many miles, but her eyes remained fixed on the distant horizon with unwavering determination. Behind her, not 20 paces back, rode Fletcher Blackwell, a cowboy whose weathered face had seen 30 summers come and go across the Arizona territory. He'd been following her for 3 days now, keeping a respectful distance, watching over her as she made her solitary pilgrimage across the unforgiving landscape of 1878. "Madam," Fletcher called out, finally spurring his dappled mare forward until he was alongside her. "You've been walking for days now. Won't you let me help you with that burden?" Rosalind didn't break her stride, didn't turn her head. The wooden cross she carried, nearly 6 feet tall and bound together with strips of rawhide, dragged a shallow furrow in the dirt behind her. "This burden is mine alone, sir," she said, her voice stronger than her appearance would suggest. "I made a promise." Fletcher nodded, removing his hat to wipe the sweat from his brow. The scorching heat of the Arizona summer showed no mercy to either of them. "At least let me walk beside you then. These parts ain't safe for a woman alone." For the first time, Rosalind turned to look at him. Her face was streaked with dust, but beneath it, Fletcher could see she was young, perhaps 25, with eyes that held both sorrow and fierce resolve. "I've been alone since Tucson," she said. "I can manage." "I don't doubt that, madam, but I'm heading to Bisbee myself, and there's no sense in us traveling separately if we're bound for the same place." He dismounted, leading his horse by the reins. "Name's Fletcher Blackwell." She hesitated, then nodded slightly. "Rosalind Lawson." "Pleased to make your acquaintance, Miss Lawson." Fletcher fell into step beside her, noticing how her arms trembled with the effort of carrying the cross. "That's quite a load you're bearing. Mind if I ask why?" Rosalind kept her eyes on the path ahead. "My father was a preacher. He built a church in Bisbee, and this cross was meant to stand atop it." Her voice caught slightly. "He died before he could finish his work. I'm going to finish it for him." Fletcher glanced at the cross, understanding dawning in his eyes. "That's a mighty long way from Tucson." 102 miles, she said. "I've walked nearly 60 of them already." "And you aim to carry that cross the whole way?" "I do." Fletcher nodded slowly, respect growing inside him as they walked side by side under the fading light. "Well then, Miss Lawson, I reckon I'll walk beside you all the way." As dusk settled over the desert, Fletcher made camp, insisting that Rosalind rest while he prepared a small fire and a modest meal of beans and jerky. She sat with her back against the cross, which she'd laid carefully on the ground beside her. The flickering firelight illuminated the exhaustion on her face. "You don't have to do this, Mr. Blackwell," she said, accepting the tin cup of coffee he offered. "I'm sure you have more important matters to attend to than escorting a woman and her father's cross to Bisbee." Fletcher settled across from her, his weathered hands cradling his own cup. "Nothing more important at the moment, Miss Lawson. Besides, my conscience wouldn't let me ride on and leave you to the mercies of this territory. Too many desperados and Apaches roaming these parts." Rosalind sipped her coffee, studying him over the rim of her cup. "And how do I know you're not a desperado yourself?" A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Fair question. I suppose you don't. But I've been trailing you for 3 days now, and if I'd meant you harm, I'd have done it already." "That's not as reassuring as you might think, Mr. Blackwell." Fletcher chuckled. "No, I suppose it isn't." He set his cup down and reached into his saddlebag, pulling out a folded piece of paper. "I'm a bounty hunter, Miss Lawson, on my way to Bisbee to collect a reward." He handed her the wanted poster, which showed the face of a bearded man with cold eyes. "Name's Jackson Wade. Robbed the bank in Tombstone, killed 2 people doing it." Rosalind studied the poster, then handed it back. "So you hunt men for money?" "I hunt criminals who've done wrong and bring them to justice," he corrected gently. "And the money helps me keep eating." A silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of a coyote. Finally, Rosalind spoke again. My father believed every soul could be redeemed, even the worst sinners. Did he now? Fletcher stared into the flames. That's a generous view of mankind. He died for that belief. Rosalind's voice was barely a whisper. 3 weeks ago, a man came to our home in Tucson, said he needed help, that men were after him. My father took him in, fed him, offered him sanctuary. Her hands tightened around the cup. The next morning, the man was gone, along with my father's horse and what little money we had. When my father went to look for him, he was shot. Not by the thief, but by lawmen who mistook him for the outlaw he'd sheltered. Fletcher's jaw tightened. I'm sorry. They apologized, too, after they realized their mistake. Bitterness tinged her words. Said my father should have known better than to help a man with the law on his tail. What about your mother? She died when I was 16. It was just my father and me these past 9 years. Rosalind set down her cup. Before he died, he made me promise to finish what he started, to carry the cross he'd built to Bisbee and see it raised above his church. Fletcher nodded slowly. A daughter's love is a powerful thing, Miss Lawson. It's all I have left to give him. She looked up at the stars, now scattered across the night sky. I sold everything we owned that wasn't nailed down to pay for his burial. Now all I have is this cross and the clothes on my back. Fletcher watched her across the fire, admiration mingling with concern. What will you do when you reach Bisbee? After the cross is where it belongs. Rosalind's shoulders lifted in a small shrug. I don't know. My father had friends there. Perhaps they'll help me find work. It's a mining town, Fletcher warned. Rough place for a woman alone. I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Blackwell. He didn't doubt it. Any woman who would carry a heavy wooden cross over 100 miles through desert heat was made of stern stuff indeed. Get some rest, Miss Lawson. We've got a long road ahead tomorrow. As Rosalind lay down beside the fire, using her small bundle of possessions as a pillow, Fletcher kept watch, his rifle across his knees. He found his gaze returning to her face, peaceful now in sleep, and wondered at the strength that drove her forward on such a journey. In his years as a bounty hunter, he'd seen all manner of cruelty and desperation, but rarely such devotion and determination. Morning came with the harsh brightness of the desert sun. Fletcher had coffee brewing before Rosalind stirred. She sat up, momentarily disoriented, then reached instinctively for the cross beside her. It's still there, Fletcher assured her, handing her a cup of coffee. No one's going to take it. Rosalind accepted the coffee gratefully. Thank you. After a moment, she added, for keeping watch, I mean. I slept better than I have in days. Glad to hear it. Fletcher offered her some hardtack and jerky. It's not much of a breakfast, but it'll keep you going. They ate in companionable silence, and as the sun climbed higher, Rosalind rose to her feet, brushing the dust from her skirts. She approached the cross, preparing to lift it once more. Let me help you get it situated, Fletcher said, moving to her side. Together, they raised the cross, positioning it so she could carry it balanced on her shoulder. Fletcher noticed the raw skin where the wood had rubbed against her for days. Wait a moment, he said, and went to his saddlebag. He returned with a small piece of leather, which he folded and placed between the cross and her shoulder. This should help with the chafing. Rosalind looked surprised by the gesture. Thank you. They set out as the day's heat began to build, Fletcher leading his mare and walking beside Rosalind. He matched his pace to hers, keeping a watchful eye on the surrounding landscape. The terrain was growing more rugged as they approached the foothills that would eventually lead them to Bisbee. How long have you been a bounty hunter, Mr. Blackwell? Rosalind asked after they'd been walking for an hour. Going on 8 years now, Fletcher replied. Before that, I rode with the Texas Rangers for a spell. And before that? Fletcher's expression grew distant. I was a rancher's son, had a small spread outside of Austin with my pa and brother. He paused, his face hardening. Lost it all during the war. Rosalind nodded, understanding. The Civil War had ended 13 years ago, but its shadow still stretched long across the land. "You fought?" "Confederate cavalry," Fletcher said shortly. "Came home to find our ranch burned, my pa dead, and my brother gone to California. There wasn't much left for me in Texas after that." "I'm sorry," Rosalind said softly. Fletcher shrugged. It was a long time ago. They walked on, the silence between them more comfortable now. Fletcher found himself admiring the way Rosalind kept moving forward despite the obvious pain and exhaustion she must be feeling. Her dress, once blue but now faded and dust-covered, hung loosely on her frame, suggesting she'd lost weight during her journey. Yet her steps remained steady, her determination unwavering. Around midday, they stopped in the sparse shade of a Joshua tree. Rosalind carefully lowered the cross to the ground, her arms trembling with the effort. Fletcher offered her his canteen. "We're making good time," he said as she drank. "Should reach the next water source by nightfall." Rosalind handed back the canteen. "You know this trail well." "I've traveled it often enough." Fletcher scanned the horizon, his experienced eye noting the distant dust cloud that might indicate riders. "We should keep moving. Don't like the look of that dust yonder." Rosalind followed his gaze, then nodded, reaching for the cross. Fletcher helped her position it on her shoulder again, noticing how she winced as it settled into place despite the leather padding. They continued their journey, moving at a slightly faster pace. Fletcher kept glancing back at the dust cloud, which seemed to be growing larger. "Riders?" Rosalind asked, noting his concern. "Could be," Fletcher acknowledged. "Could be nothing more than the wind stirring up dust. But I'd rather not take chances." They pressed on for another hour before Fletcher's suspicions were confirmed. The sound of hoofbeats carried to them on the still desert air, and when he looked back, he could make out 3 riders approaching rapidly. "Miss Lawson," he said urgently, "I need you to take cover behind those rocks, now." Rosalind hesitated. "What about the cross?" "Leave it for now," Fletcher insisted, already leading her toward a cluster of large boulders off the trail. "Those men are riding too fast and too purposeful to be friendly travelers." Reluctantly, Rosalind allowed him to guide her behind the rocks, leaving the cross lying on the trail. Fletcher tied his horse securely to a scrubby mesquite, then positioned himself with a clear view of the approaching riders, his rifle at the ready. The 3 men reined in their horses when they reached the abandoned cross. They were rough-looking sorts, trail-worn and armed to the teeth. Fletcher recognized the type immediately, outlaws or deserters turned bandits, preying on lone travelers in these remote stretches of territory. "Hello, the rocks!" one of them called out, a burly man with a thick beard. "We see you there. Come on out, and there won't be no trouble." Fletcher remained silent, his finger resting lightly on the trigger of his rifle. "Last chance," the man shouted. "We just want the horse and whatever valuables you got. Come out peaceful-like, and we'll let you live." "That's mighty generous of you," Fletcher called back, his voice steady. "But I think we'll stay put. Ride on, and there won't be any bloodshed today." The 3 men exchanged glances. Then the bearded one spat on the ground. "3 of us, 1 of you. Them ain't good odds, mister." "Better than you think," Fletcher replied calmly. "I've got a clear shot at all 3 of you, and I don't miss." To demonstrate his point, he fired a single shot that knocked the hat clean off the head of the man on the left. The bandit yelped in surprise, his hand flying to his scalp. "Next one goes between the eyes," Fletcher warned. "Now ride on." The bandits conferred briefly, clearly reassessing their options. Finally, the bearded leader scowled and gestured to his companions. "This ain't worth dying over. Let's go." As they turned their horses to leave, the bearded man shouted, "You best watch your back, mister. These trails ain't safe for a man who makes enemies." Fletcher kept his rifle trained on them until they were well out of sight. Only then did he lower the weapon and turn to Rosalind, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation. "Are you all right?" he asked. She nodded, her face pale but composed. "Yes, thank you." Together they returned to the trail, where the cross lay undisturbed. As Rosalind prepared to lift it once more, Fletcher stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. "It's not safe to continue on this trail," he said. Those men might circle back, or there could be others. We need to take a different route. But this is the most direct path to Bisbee, Rosalind protested. Direct, yes. Safe, no. Fletcher glanced at the cross. And carrying that makes us visible for miles. We need to travel more cautiously. Rosalind looked torn, glancing from the cross to the open trail ahead. I promised my father. Your father wouldn't want you risking your life needlessly, Fletcher said gently. There's another way to Bisbee through the hills. It's longer, but safer. How much longer? A day, maybe 2. Fletcher met her gaze steadily. But we'll get there, Miss Lawson. I promise you that. After a moment's hesitation, Rosalind nodded. All right, we'll take your route. Fletcher smiled, relief evident in his face. Good. And if it makes the journey easier, I could strap the cross to my horse for stretches of the way. Rosalind shook her head firmly. No, I promise to carry it myself. Even the strongest shoulders need rest sometimes, Fletcher said. Think of it this way. If you wear yourself out completely, you might not make it to Bisbee at all. What good would that do your father's memory? Rosalind considered his words, her expression thoughtful. Perhaps you're right. But only for short distances, when the terrain is too difficult. Fletcher nodded, satisfied with the compromise. Let's get moving then. I want to reach the hills before nightfall. They set off again, this time angling away from the main trail toward a line of low hills to the east. The going was rougher here, with loose stones and patches of prickly pear cactus to navigate around. Rosalind struggled more on this terrain, the cross becoming increasingly unwieldy as fatigue set in. After watching her stumble for the 3rd time, Fletcher stopped. Miss Lawson, please, let me secure the cross to my horse just until we reach safer ground. This time, Rosalind didn't argue. She allowed Fletcher to carefully tie the cross to his mare, securing it so it wouldn't damage the animal or slip free. Even without her burden, Rosalind walked with obvious exhaustion, her steps less certain than before. We'll make camp early tonight, Fletcher decided, noticing how she swayed slightly as they climbed a gentle slope. There's a small spring about 2 miles ahead where we can rest and refill our canteens. Rosalind merely nodded, conserving her energy for walking. Fletcher found himself admiring her tenacity even as he worried about her health. The desert was unforgiving to those who pushed themselves too hard. They reached the spring as the sun was beginning to dip toward the western horizon. It was little more than a trickle of water emerging from a crack in a rocky outcropping, but it was clean and cool. Rosalind sank down beside it gratefully, cupping her hands to drink while Fletcher saw to his horse. After setting up a small camp and starting a fire, Fletcher rummaged in his saddlebags and produced a small cloth-wrapped package. I've been saving this for an emergency, he said, unwrapping what proved to be salt pork and a few potatoes. Figured this qualifies. Rosalind watched as he sliced the potatoes and pork into a small skillet, her stomach growling audibly at the prospect of a hot meal. You're very well prepared, Mr. Blackwell. In my line of work, you learn to expect the unexpected. He glanced up at her with a small smile. And please call me Fletcher. Mr. Blackwell makes me feel like my pa. A hint of a smile touched Rosalind's lips. Then you must call me Rosalind, rather than Miss Lawson. Rosalind, he repeated, liking the sound of it. It suits you. As the food cooked, filling the air with a mouth-watering aroma, Rosalind gazed at the cross now propped against a nearby rock. My father worked on that cross for weeks, she said softly. He cut down the tree himself, shaped and sanded the wood until it was smooth. He said a cross should be beautiful, not rough-hewn, to honor the sacrifice it represents. Fletcher nodded, understanding the craftsmanship that had gone into the piece. The wood was indeed finely worked, the crossbeam joined to the upright with precise joinery rather than simply nailed together. He was a skilled woodworker, your father, he observed. He built furniture before he became a preacher, Rosalind explained. Said working with his hands helped him understand God's creation better. She traced a finger along the grain of the wood. This was to be his greatest work, the final touch for the church he'd been building in Bisbee for the past year. He built an entire church by himself? Fletcher asked, impressed. With help from some of the townspeople, yes. He'd go for months at a time, then return to Tucson where we lived. Rosalind's eyes grew distant with memory. The last time he came home, he told me the church was nearly finished. All that remained was to raise the cross above it. He'd been working on this one for weeks, getting it just right. Fletcher dished up the food, handing Rosalind a tin plate. And then the incident with the outlaw happened. Rosalind nodded, accepting the plate with murmured thanks. 2 days before he was to return to Bisbee with the cross. She took a small bite, closing her eyes briefly at the simple pleasure of hot food. When I buried him, I knew what I had to do. His work needed to be completed. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the crackling fire and night sounds of the desert their only companions. Fletcher found himself studying Rosalind's face in the firelight, noting the quiet strength in her features, the grace with which she bore her grief and her burden. She was beautiful, he realized, in a way that went beyond mere physical appearance, though she possessed that too, with her auburn hair and clear gray eyes. "What will you do after Bisbee?" he asked finally. "After the cross is where it belongs?" Rosalind set down her empty plate, considering the question. "I hadn't thought much beyond fulfilling my promise. Perhaps I'll stay there, if I can find work. My father spoke highly of the people, said they were building a real community despite the rough nature of the mining camp." "It's changed some in recent years," Fletcher acknowledged. "Still plenty rough around the edges. But there are families there now, businesses beyond just the saloons and brothels." "And what of you?" Rosalind asked. "After you've captured this outlaw you're hunting?" Fletcher shrugged. "Move on to the next job, I suppose. That's how it usually goes." "Doesn't that get lonely? Always moving, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots?" The question caught him off guard. It had been years since Fletcher had thought about loneliness or roots or anything beyond the next bounty, the next trail to follow. "I suppose it does," he admitted. "But it's been my life for so long now, I hardly notice anymore." Rosalind studied him across the fire. "That sounds like a sad way to live, Fletcher." He couldn't disagree, but he had no ready answer for her. Instead, he rose to his feet, gathering their plates. "You should get some rest. Tomorrow will be another long day." As Rosalind settled down for the night, Fletcher took the first watch, his mind turning over her words. A sad way to live. Yes, perhaps it was. But what else was there for a man like him, with blood on his hands and too many years spent chasing wanted men across the territories? He glanced at Rosalind's sleeping form, then at the cross silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Redemption, her father would probably say. But Fletcher wasn't sure he believed in such things anymore. The next morning dawned cooler, with clouds gathering on the horizon that promised the possibility of rain, a rare and welcome prospect in the parched landscape. They ate a quick breakfast of leftover potatoes and set out, Rosalind once again insisting on carrying the cross herself now that they were on somewhat easier terrain. Fletcher walked beside her, leading his mare, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings for any sign of danger. The hills provided better cover from anyone who might be looking for them, but they also offered more places for ambush. His hand never strayed far from his revolver. "Tell me about your father's church," he said as they navigated a narrow passage between two rocky outcroppings. "What made him decide to build it in Bisbee of all places?" Rosalind adjusted the cross on her shoulder before answering. "He visited there 3 years ago and was troubled by what he saw men working themselves to death in the mines, with nothing but saloons and gambling houses to comfort them in their off hours. No place for the spirit, he said. A small smile touched her lips. That was how he always described it, a town with no place for the spirit. So he decided to build one. Just like that, he decided to build a church in a town where he didn't even live. That was my father, Rosalind said, affection evident in her voice. When he felt called to do something, nothing would stop him. He'd travel to Bisbee, work for a few weeks, then come home to Tucson to check on me and replenish his supplies. It became a pattern these past few years. Sounds like a determined man, Fletcher observed. He was. Rosalind's face grew solemn. The last time I saw him, he was so excited. The church was nearly complete, just needed the finishing touches and the cross to be raised. One more trip, he told me, and it will be done. Her voice caught slightly. He never made that trip. Fletcher reached out impulsively, touching her arm in a gesture of comfort. He'd be proud of you, Rosalind, carrying on his work like this. She glanced at him, surprise and something warmer flickering in her eyes at his touch. Thank you. They continued their journey through the hills, the terrain gradually becoming more hospitable as they descended toward a small valley that would eventually lead them back in the direction of Bisbee. The clouds overhead grew thicker, bringing welcome shade, but also the threat of a sudden desert downpour. Around midday, the first fat raindrops began to fall. Fletcher quickly led Rosalind to the shelter of an overhanging rock formation, helping her lower the cross to the ground before the rain could make the wood slippery and dangerous to carry. They huddled together in the shallow cave formed by the overhang, watching as the rain intensified into a proper downpour. The parched earth seemed to sigh with relief as it drank in the moisture, and the air filled with the rich scent of wet dust and desert plants. It's beautiful, Rosalind murmured, her face alight with simple pleasure at the natural spectacle. Fletcher found himself watching her rather than the rain, struck by the way her eyes reflected the stormy light, the way a few loose strands of her hair had curled from the humidity. Yes, he agreed quietly. Beautiful. She turned to find him looking at her, and something passed between them, a moment of connection that went beyond words. Rosalind looked away first, a flush rising to her cheeks. It shouldn't last long, Fletcher said, returning his attention to the rainfall. Desert storms rarely do. My father always said rain in the desert was God's way of reminding us that blessings can come even in the harshest places, Rosalind mused. Fletcher considered her words. Your father sounds like he was a wise man. He was. Rosalind drew her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. Though not everyone thought so. Some found his devotion excessive, even foolish. Building a church in a mining town where most men cared more for gold and whiskey than salvation. And what do you think? Fletcher asked. Was he foolish? Rosalind met his gaze steadily. I think faith without action is meaningless. My father lived what he believed. How many of us can say the same? The question hung between them as the rain continued to drum on the earth outside their shelter. Fletcher found himself without an answer. What did he believe in strongly enough to shape his life around? Justice, perhaps, but was that what truly drove him to hunt down wanted men? Or was it merely the thrill of the chase, the satisfaction of being good at something, the independence it afforded him? The rain began to slacken after about 20 minutes, dwindling to a light drizzle that misted the landscape. They emerged from their shelter to find the world transformed, the dusty earth now dark with moisture. Desert flowers already beginning to unfurl in response to the unexpected bounty of water. We should make good time now, Fletcher said, helping Rosalind position the cross on her shoulder once more. The rain will have settled the dust and made the ground more solid for walking. They set off again, their spirits lifted by the change in weather. The air felt cleaner, cooler, and the desert itself seemed more vibrant, as if awakened from a long slumber. Even Rosalind's step seemed lighter despite her burden, and Fletcher found himself smiling at her obvious enjoyment of their surroundings. As they walked, Fletcher began to point out features of the landscape to her, the different types of cactus, the birds that darted overhead, the distant peaks that marked the mountain range they were skirting. Rosalind listened with interest, asking questions that revealed both her intelligence and her lack of experience with the desert environment. You know a great deal about this territory, she observed after he explained how to identify which plants held water in an emergency. I've spent most of my adult life crossing back and forth across it, Fletcher replied. You learn to read the land or you don't survive out here. It's beautiful in its own way, Rosalind said, looking out over the vast expanse of rugged terrain, different from the farmland where I grew up in Missouri, but beautiful nonetheless. How did you end up in Arizona territory? Fletcher asked, curious about the journey that had brought her so far from her birthplace. My father brought us west after my mother died, Rosalind explained. Said he needed a fresh start, someplace where the memories weren't so painful. I was 16 at the time, old enough to help with the journey, but young enough to be terrified of leaving everything I knew behind. That couldn't have been easy. It wasn't at first, but my father had a way of making even the hardest things seem meaningful. She adjusted the cross slightly on her shoulder. He'd say, "Rosie, God never gives us burdens we can't carry." I thought of that when I started this journey. Fletcher glanced at the cross she bore, then back at her face. Seems your father was right about that. They continued their journey through the afternoon, making good progress through the landscape that had been refreshed by the rain. As evening approached, Fletcher led them to a small clearing surrounded by mesquite trees, a good defensive position with clear lines of sight in all directions. As they set up camp, Fletcher noticed Rosalind wincing as she lowered the cross to the ground. "Let me see your shoulder," he said, concern evident in his voice. Rosalind hesitated, then turned slightly, pulling aside the collar of her dress to reveal the skin beneath. Despite the leather padding Fletcher had provided, her shoulder was raw and blistered from the constant pressure and friction of carrying the heavy wooden cross. "That needs tending," Fletcher said firmly. He went to his saddlebags and returned with a small tin of salve. "This will help. My mother's recipe, good for burns, blisters, just about anything that ails the skin." Rosalind looked uncertain. "I couldn't—" "You can and you will," Fletcher interrupted gently. "If that gets infected, you won't be carrying anything to Bisbee, let alone a wooden cross." After a moment's hesitation, Rosalind nodded. She sat down with her back to Fletcher, moving her hair aside and lowering her collar just enough to expose the injured shoulder. Fletcher knelt behind her, opening the tin and carefully applying the salve to the raw skin. He worked with gentle fingers, acutely aware of the intimacy of the moment. Rosalind remained still beneath his touch, her breath coming a little faster than normal. When he finished, his hand lingered for a moment longer than necessary on her shoulder. "Thank you," Rosalind said softly, adjusting her dress back into place and turning to face him. Their eyes met, and Fletcher found himself unable to look away from the warmth in her gaze. "You're welcome," he replied, his voice rougher than usual. He cleared his throat and moved back, putting a safer distance between them. "We should eat something." They shared a simple meal as darkness fell, the night cooler than usual after the rain. Rosalind sat close to the fire, her arms wrapped around herself for warmth. Without a word, Fletcher removed his coat and placed it around her shoulders. "Won't you be cold?" she asked, looking up at him. "I'm used to it," he assured her, settling back down across the fire. "Gets a lot colder than this up in the mountains during winter hunts." Rosalind pulled his coat more tightly around herself, breathing in the scent of leather, wood smoke, and something uniquely Fletcher. "Thank you," she said simply. They sat in comfortable silence for a time, the crackling fire and night sounds of the desert creating a peaceful backdrop. Fletcher found himself studying Rosalind's face in the firelight, noting the strength in her delicate features, the determination that animated her expression even in repose. "You remind me of someone," he said suddenly. Rosalind looked up, curiosity in her eyes. "Who?" "My mother," Fletcher said, surprised at himself for bringing it up. He rarely spoke of his family to anyone. She had that same look you get, like nothing in the world could stop her once she'd set her mind to something. "I'll take that as a compliment," Rosalind said with a small smile. "It is." Fletcher poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward into the night sky. "She held our family together through everything: drought, hardship, the early years of the war. Nothing seemed to shake her faith that things would work out in the end." "What happened to her?" Rosalind asked gently. Fletcher's expression darkened. Typhoid in '63. I was away fighting when it happened. By the time I got the news and could get home on leave, she was already gone. He tossed the stick into the fire. Sometimes I think if she'd lived, things might have turned out differently. Pa wouldn't have let himself go to ruin. The ranch might have survived. You can't know that, Rosalind said quietly. Some things are beyond our control, no matter how strong we are. Fletcher nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words. I suppose so. Still, I've never met anyone with her kind of strength until now. He looked directly at Rosalind. Carrying that cross all this way, alone, through country that would make most men think twice, that takes a special kind of courage. Rosalind lowered her eyes, uncomfortable with the praise. It's not courage. It's just keeping a promise. Then you're the most faithful promise keeper I've ever met, Fletcher said with a small smile. They fell silent again, each lost in their own thoughts as the fire burned lower. Finally, Rosalind spoke again, her voice soft in the darkness. Fletcher, may I ask you something? Of course. Why did you really decide to walk with me? The truth, please. Fletcher considered the question, knowing she deserved an honest answer. At first, it was concern. A woman alone in this territory, carrying something as conspicuous as that cross it was asking for trouble. He paused, looking into the embers of the fire. But then, I admired your determination, and I suppose I was curious about what would drive someone to undertake such a journey. And now? Rosalind's eyes were steady on his face. Fletcher met her gaze across the dying fire. Now I'm glad I made the decision, whatever my reasons were at the start. A small smile touched Rosalind's lips. So am I. The next morning, they set out early, hoping to cover significant ground before the heat of the day set in. Rosalind's shoulder was less inflamed thanks to Fletcher's salve, but he could see that carrying the cross still caused her pain. Nevertheless, she refused his repeated offers to secure it to his horse, insisting on keeping her promise in the way she felt her father would have wanted. We should reach Bisbee by tomorrow evening if we maintain this pace, Fletcher said as they walked side by side through a wide valley dotted with saguaro cactus. Assuming no more unexpected encounters. Have you been to my father's church? Rosalind asked. Would you recognize it? Fletcher shook his head. I've been to Bisbee several times, but I can't say I paid much attention to any churches. Mining towns aren't known for their religious atmosphere. My father described it to me in his letters, Rosalind said. It's on the eastern edge of town, built of stone with a wooden roof and a small bell tower. He was particularly proud of the bell, said he'd traded 3 months of carpentry work to get it from a merchant in Tucson. We'll find it, Fletcher assured her. Bisbee isn't so large that a church would be hard to locate. As the day progressed, the terrain became more rugged, transitioning from desert plains to foothills. They were approaching the Mule Mountains, within which Bisbee was nestled. The going was slower here, the path steeper and less defined. By mid-afternoon, they had climbed high enough to get a view of the landscape they had traversed. Fletcher called a halt at a viewpoint, allowing Rosalind to rest and take in the spectacular vista of the desert stretching away to the horizon. It's magnificent, she breathed, carefully setting down the cross and stretching her aching arms. Like looking at the ocean, but of sand and stone instead of water. Fletcher nodded, passing her his canteen. One of the reasons I've never been able to settle in one place, I suppose. There's always another horizon to see, another landscape to cross. Rosalind drank deeply, then handed back the canteen. But don't you ever wish for something more permanent? A home, a family? The question caught Fletcher off guard. It had been years since he'd allowed himself to think about such possibilities. Once, perhaps, he admitted. After the war, I thought I might find a piece of land somewhere, start fresh. But circumstances led me down a different path. What circumstances? Rosalind asked, her eyes curious. Fletcher's expression grew distant. My first bounty was personal. A man who'd cheated my father, taken advantage of his grief after my mother died. By the time I tracked him down, I discovered I had a knack for finding people who didn't want to be found. One job led to another, and before I knew it, years had passed. And now? Fletcher looked out over the vast landscape. Now I'm 34 years old with little to show for it but a good horse, a reliable gun, and a reputation that ensures I'll never lack for work. That sounds lonely, Rosalind said softly. Fletcher shrugged. It's the life I chose. But is it the life you want? Fletcher had no answer for that. Instead, he changed the subject. We should keep moving if we want to reach a good camping spot before dark. They continued their journey, climbing steadily into the foothills. The vegetation changed as they ascended, with juniper and oak trees appearing among the desert plants. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of pine from the higher elevations. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, they reached a small plateau with a clear spring bubbling up from the rocks. Fletcher declared it a good place to make camp for their final night on the trail. Bisbee is just over those ridges, he said, gesturing toward the higher peaks ahead. We'll reach it by tomorrow afternoon. Rosalind nodded, carefully lowering the cross beside a large boulder. Her face showed a complex mixture of emotions, relief that their journey was nearly complete, but also a certain sadness, as if she wasn't quite ready for it to end. Fletcher busied himself with making camp, gathering wood for a fire, and seeing to his horse. Rosalind helped as much as she could, though he could see her movements were stiff with exhaustion and the lingering pain in her shoulder. As twilight deepened around them, they sat beside the fire, sharing the last of Fletcher's provisions, beans, jerky, and a handful of dried apples he'd been saving for a special occasion. Tomorrow you'll fulfill your promise, Fletcher said, watching Rosalind across the fire. How does that feel? Rosalind considered the question, her gaze drifting to the cross that had been her constant companion for so many miles. Like completing a circle, she said finally, like my father's work, and mine, will finally be finished. She looked up at Fletcher. But also like an ending. And endings are always a little sad, aren't they? Fletcher nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. They can be. But they can also be the beginning of something new. Rosalind's eyes met his, a question in their depths. What comes next for you, Fletcher, after Bisbee? It was the same question she had asked before, but this time, Fletcher found he had a different answer. I'm not sure anymore, he admitted. For the first time in years, I'm finding myself wondering if there might be alternatives. Alternatives to bounty hunting, you mean? Alternatives to wandering, Fletcher clarified, to always being on the move, always alone. A silence fell between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Rosalind was the first to break it. I've been thinking, she said, her voice soft in the gathering darkness, about what I'll do after the cross is placed. I have no home to return to, no family left. She took a deep breath. My father's friends in Bisbee, he wrote about them often, a couple named Thomas and Sarah Miller. Thomas is a carpenter who helped with the church, and Sarah runs a small school for the miners' children. In his last letter, my father mentioned that Sarah was looking for help with the school. You're considering staying in Bisbee, then? Fletcher asked, his heart beating a little faster at the possibility. Rosalind nodded. I taught alongside my father in Tucson. We had a small school in the back of our home. It's work I know and enjoy. She hesitated, then added, and perhaps it would be a way to continue my father's legacy. Education was as important to him as faith. Fletcher found himself smiling. I think you'd make a fine teacher, Rosalind. Thank you, she replied, a hint of color touching her cheeks at his praise. It's just a thought, of course. The Millers might not need help after all, or they might have found someone else by now. If they have any sense, they'll hire you on the spot, Fletcher said firmly. Any school would be lucky to have a teacher with your determination and spirit. Rosalind laughed softly, the sound warming Fletcher more than the fire before them. You hardly know me, Fletcher Blackwell. I know enough, he replied simply. I've seen how you face challenges, how you keep your promises, how you bear hardship without complaint. Those are rare qualities. Their eyes met across the fire. And in that moment, something shifted between them, a recognition of feelings that had been growing throughout their journey together. Fletcher found himself wanting to cross the space that separated them, to take her hand, to express in actions what he was only beginning to understand in words. Before he could move, however, a sound from the darkness beyond their camp froze them both, the unmistakable click of a rifle being cocked. "Well, ain't this touching?" came a rough voice, followed by the appearance of a bearded figure at the edge of the firelight. "Told you we'd be seeing you again." Fletcher cursed silently as he recognized the leader of the bandits they had encountered days earlier. The man wasn't alone. His two companions emerged from the shadows, their guns trained on Fletcher and Rosalind. "Stand up slow," the bearded man ordered, "and keep your hands where I can see them." Fletcher rose carefully, his mind racing through possibilities. His rifle was propped against a nearby rock. His revolver holstered at his hip, both out of reach as long as the bandits had the drop on him. "What do you want?" he asked, keeping his voice level. "We have little of value." "That's where you're wrong," the bandit replied with a yellow-toothed grin. "Your horse alone is worth a pretty penny. And then there's the matter of you shooting off my friend's hat and making us look like fools." He gestured with his rifle. "Toss your gun belt over here, nice and easy." Fletcher complied, his jaw tight with anger at himself for not being more vigilant. He should have known the bandits might track them, looking for revenge. "The lady's mighty pretty, too," one of the other bandits remarked, leering at Rosalind, who had risen to stand beside Fletcher. "Might be worth taking along with us." "You won't touch her," Fletcher said, his voice low and dangerous. The bearded leader laughed. "You ain't exactly in a position to be making demands, mister." He jerked his head toward Rosalind. "Check her for valuables, Hank." As the bandit called Hank approached Rosalind, Fletcher tensed, preparing to act despite the rifles aimed at him. But before he could move, Rosalind herself acted. In one swift motion, she grabbed the cross that leaned against the boulder and swung it with all her strength, catching Hank squarely across the chest. The unexpected attack knocked the bandit backward, his rifle discharging harmlessly into the air. In the moment of confusion that followed, Fletcher lunged for his own weapon, diving and rolling as shots rang out around him. He came up with his revolver in hand, firing twice in rapid succession. One bandit fell immediately, clutching his shoulder. The bearded leader and the third man dove for cover, returning fire from behind the rocks that surrounded the clearing. "Rosalind, get down!" Fletcher shouted, spotting her still standing, the cross held before her like a shield. A bullet splintered the wood near her hands, and Fletcher's heart nearly stopped. He fired again, hearing a cry of pain that told him he'd hit his mark. The shooting from behind the rocks ceased. Silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the moaning of the wounded bandits. Fletcher approached cautiously, gun still raised, and confirmed that the threat had been neutralized, one man dead, the other two too badly wounded to pose any further danger. He turned to Rosalind, who stood trembling, still clutching the cross. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, crossing to her side. She shook her head, though her face was pale with shock. "No, I'm unharmed." Her gaze fell to the cross, where a bullet had gouged a deep furrow in the wood. "But you're shot. The cross." "Better the wood than you," Fletcher said firmly, gently taking the cross from her hands and setting it aside. He guided her to sit down by the fire, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. "Stay here while I deal with them." Fletcher secured the surviving bandits, binding their wounds as best he could with strips torn from one of his spare shirts. They wouldn't die from their injuries, but neither would they be following anyone for a good long while. He collected their weapons and removed the firing pins before tossing the guns back beside them. "If you're smart, you'll stay put until morning," he told them coldly. "Then make your way back down to the valley. Try to follow us again, and I won't be so merciful next time." Returning to Rosalind, Fletcher found her staring into the fire, her arms wrapped tightly around herself despite his coat. He sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, offering silent support. "I've never seen a man die before," she said quietly after a long moment. Fletcher nodded, understanding. "I'm sorry you had to witness that." "You had no choice," Rosalind said, looking up at him with clear eyes. "They would have killed us both. Or worse." She shivered slightly. "What you said about the dangers for a woman traveling alone. I understand it better now." Fletcher put his arm around her and she leaned into his embrace, her head resting against his shoulder. They sat that way for a long time, the warmth of the fire and each other keeping the night's chill at bay. "The cross," Rosalind said eventually, her voice steadier now. "The bullet damaged it." "I saw," Fletcher replied, "but it's still intact. The damage is superficial. It doesn't affect its strength or purpose." Rosalind was quiet for a moment, considering this. Perhaps it's fitting, in a way. "My father always said that faith is tested by fire, that true strength comes from surviving hardship." She straightened slightly, though she didn't move away from Fletcher's arm around her. "The cross has made its own journey now, bearing its own scars, just as we all do." Fletcher looked down at her upturned face, struck by the wisdom and resilience in her words. Without thinking, he reached up to brush a strand of hair from her cheek. His hand lingered, cupping her face gently. "Rosalind," he said softly, her name a question and an answer all at once. She met his gaze steadily, her eyes reflecting the firelight and something warmer, deeper. "Fletcher," she replied, just as softly. He leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to pull away if she wished. But Rosalind didn't move except to lift her face toward his, her lips parting slightly in invitation. Their kiss was gentle at first, a tentative exploration of newfound feelings. Then Rosalind's hand came up to rest against Fletcher's chest, and the kiss deepened, becoming something more urgent, more honest. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. "I didn't expect this," Rosalind admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I set out from Tucson, I never imagined—" "Neither did I," Fletcher said, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. "But I'm glad for it, whatever happens next." Rosalind smiled, a true smile that lit her entire face and made Fletcher's heart skip a beat. "So am I." They remained by the fire long into the night, talking quietly, sharing gentle touches and occasional kisses. Fletcher told Rosalind about his childhood in Texas, about his dreams before the war had changed everything. Rosalind spoke of her mother, of growing up in Missouri, of her father's unwavering faith that had shaped her life. As the fire burned down to embers, Fletcher reluctantly suggested they try to get some sleep. "We still have a journey to complete tomorrow," he reminded her. Rosalind nodded, though she seemed as reluctant as he was to end this moment between them. Will you hold me while I sleep?" she asked, a hint of shyness in her voice. "Just to hold me, nothing more. I don't think I can bear to be alone tonight, after everything that's happened." Fletcher's answer was to spread his bedroll near the dying fire and open his arms to her. Rosalind settled against him, her head on his shoulder, his coat spread over them both like a blanket. It was the most natural thing in the world to hold her this way, as if they had been meant to find this comfort in each other all along. "Rest now," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I'll keep you safe." Rosalind's breathing gradually slowed and deepened as she drifted into sleep, secure in Fletcher's embrace. He remained awake longer, watching the stars wheel overhead and listening to the night sounds of the mountains. For the first time in more years than he could remember, Fletcher Blackwell felt at peace. Morning came with a clarity that only high desert air can bring, the sky a perfect cloudless blue. Fletcher woke with Rosalind still nestled against him, her auburn hair spread across his chest like silk. He lay still, savoring the moment, until she stirred and opened her eyes. "Good morning," she said, a shy smile touching her lips as she looked up at him. "Good morning," he replied, brushing a kiss against her forehead before reluctantly sitting up. "We should get an early start if we want to reach Bisbee by afternoon." They prepared for the final leg of their journey, with a new awareness of each other, exchanging glances and small touches that spoke volumes about how things had changed between them. Fletcher checked on the bandits before they left, finding one dead from his wounds and the other having fled during the night. He said nothing of this to Rosalind, not wanting to darken her spirits on this day of all days. The cross had indeed survived its encounter with the bullet, though the gouge in the wood was clearly visible. Rosalind ran her fingers over it thoughtfully before lifting the cross to her shoulder. "Let me," Fletcher said, stepping forward to help position it more comfortably. His hands lingered on her shoulders, and Rosalind leaned back against him briefly before straightening with renewed determination. "Today we finish what we started," she said, her voice strong and clear in the morning air. They set off along the mountain trail, climbing steadily toward the pass that would lead them down into Bisbee. The way was steep but well-defined, suggesting it was used regularly by travelers between the mining town and the surrounding areas. As they walked, Fletcher found himself thinking about the future, a subject he had avoided for years. What would happen when they reached Bisbee? Would Rosalind find the Millers, secure a position at the school? And what of him? The outlaw he had been tracking would still be there, the bounty still waiting to be claimed. But after that, "What are you thinking about?" Rosalind asked, noting his thoughtful expression. Fletcher hesitated, then decided on honesty. "About what happens after today, after we place the cross." "And what do you think happens?" Rosalind asked, her tone carefully neutral. "I don't know," Fletcher admitted. "I only know that I'm not ready to say goodbye to you, Rosalind." She was silent for a moment, adjusting the cross on her shoulder. "I'm not ready for that either," she said finally, her voice soft but certain. "These past days with you, they've changed something in me, awakened something I thought might be gone forever after my father died." "What's that?" "Hope," Rosalind said simply. "Hope for a future that holds more than just duty and obligation." Fletcher's heart lifted at her words. "I feel the same way," he said. "For years I've been drifting from one bounty to the next, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. But now—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Now I find myself wanting something more permanent." They reached the crest of the pass, and suddenly Bisbee lay before them, nestled in a steep canyon below. It was a haphazard collection of buildings clinging to the sides of the ravine, dominated by the structures of the copper mine that was the town's lifeblood. Smoke rose from smelters, and even from this distance, they could see the busy movement of people in the streets. "There it is," Fletcher said, pointing. "Bisbee." Rosalind gazed down at the town, her expression a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. "Can you see a church? On the eastern edge?" Fletcher scanned the buildings, then nodded. "There, that structure with the small bell tower. That must be it." Rosalind's breath caught as she spotted the church her father had built. It was indeed on the eastern outskirts of town, a simple stone building with a wooden roof and a modest bell tower. Even from a distance, she could see it was well constructed, solid enough to withstand the test of time. "It's just as he described it," she whispered, tears springing to her eyes. "He did it. He really built it." Fletcher squeezed her shoulder gently. "And now you'll complete it, just as you promised." They began their descent into the canyon, following the switchback trail that would lead them into Bisbee. As they drew closer to the town, they began to attract attention. It wasn't every day that the residents saw a woman carrying a large wooden cross, accompanied by a trail-worn cowboy. People stopped to stare, some pointing, others calling to neighbors to come see the unusual sight. By the time they reached the outskirts of town, a small crowd had gathered, curious about the newcomers and their strange burden. Fletcher stayed close to Rosalind, his hand never far from his revolver, though the onlookers seemed more intrigued than threatening. "That's Preacher Lawson's church," one old-timer remarked to another as they passed. "Heard he died down Tucson way." "Must be kin," the other replied, eyeing Rosalind with new interest. "Carrying his cross for him, looks like." Rosalind kept her eyes fixed on the church ahead, drawing strength from its solid presence and from Fletcher's steady presence beside her. The streets of Bisbee were rough and uneven, making the final stretch of their journey more difficult, but Rosalind's steps never faltered. As they approached the church, the door opened, and an older couple emerged, a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a woman whose kind face showed immediate recognition when she saw Rosalind. "It's Rosalind!" the woman exclaimed, hurrying forward. "Thomas, it's Rosalind Jacob's daughter." "Sarah," Rosalind said, emotion making her voice tremble. "Mr. Miller." The couple reached them just as Rosalind arrived at the church's small yard. With Fletcher's help, she carefully lowered the cross to the ground, her journey finally complete. Sarah Miller embraced Rosalind immediately, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Child, we heard about your father. We've been so worried about you. And now, here you are with—" She broke off, looking at the cross, understanding dawning in her eyes. "He made it for the church," Rosalind explained, her own tears flowing freely now. "Before he died. I promised him I would bring it here, that his work would be finished." Thomas Miller, a carpenter like Rosalind's father, knelt to examine the cross. "Fine workmanship," he said gruffly, his voice thick with emotion. "Jacob always did beautiful work." He looked up at Rosalind. "And you carried this all the way from Tucson?" "She did," Fletcher confirmed, pride evident in his voice, "every step of the way." Thomas noticed the bullet gouge in the wood, raising an eyebrow in question. "We ran into some trouble on the trail," Fletcher explained briefly. "The cross took a bullet that might otherwise have found Rosalind." Thomas nodded, understanding. "Then it's already saved a life, even before being raised." He stood, offering his hand to Fletcher. "And you are?" "Fletcher Blackwell," he replied, shaking the offered hand. "I've been walking beside Miss Lawson for the last portion of her journey." "And a blessing that you were," Sarah said warmly, still holding Rosalind close. "The trails are no place for a woman alone these days." By now, a sizable crowd had gathered around the church, word spreading quickly through the small town about the arrival of Preacher Lawson's daughter with the cross for the church. Many of the onlookers had known Jacob Lawson, had helped with the building of the church, and they regarded Rosalind with respect and sympathy. "When will you raise it?" someone called out from the crowd. Thomas Miller looked at Rosalind questioningly. She straightened her shoulders, wiping away her tears. "Today," she said firmly. "My father's work will be completed today." A murmur of approval ran through the crowd. Thomas nodded. "I'll fetch my tools and some of the men who helped build the church. We'll have it raised before sunset." As the crowd dispersed, some going to spread the news, others to gather tools and materials needed for raising the cross, Sarah Miller led Rosalind and Fletcher into the church. The interior was simple but beautiful, with hand-hewn pews, a modest altar, and windows that let in streams of afternoon light. The craftsmanship was evident in every detail, from the carved pulpit to the smoothly finished floor. "He did this," Rosalind breathed, turning slowly to take in the full space. "All of this." "With help," Sarah acknowledged. "But yes, this was Jacob's vision, his passion. He wouldn't rest until it was done." She touched Rosalind's arm gently. "And now you've brought the final piece. He would be so proud, child." Rosalind nodded, too overwhelmed for words. Fletcher stood quietly by the door, giving her this moment to connect with her father's legacy. Sarah turned to him with a warm smile. "Mr. Blackwell, you must be exhausted from your journey. Our home is just down the street. Why don't you come wash up and rest while the men prepare to raise the cross? I'll show Rosalind to our guest room as well. She'll be staying with us, of course." Fletcher hesitated, glancing at Rosalind. "Thank you for the offer, Mrs. Miller, but I have some business to attend to in town first. I'll return for the raising of the cross." Rosalind met his gaze across the church, a question in her eyes. Fletcher gave her a reassuring nod, a silent promise that he would indeed return. Outside the church, Fletcher retrieved his horse and made his way toward the center of Bisbee. The mining town was bustling with activity, the main street lined with saloons, stores, and boarding houses. Fletcher headed for the sheriff's office, his mind on the outlaw he'd been tracking and the bounty that awaited him. But for the first time in his career, the prospect of collecting a reward seemed secondary to the possibilities that had opened up before him. The sheriff of Bisbee, a grizzled man named Harker, recognized Fletcher immediately. "Blackwell," he said, rising from behind his desk. "Figured you'd show up sooner or later. You're here for Wade, I reckon." "That's right," Fletcher confirmed. "Word was he was hiding out in these parts." Sheriff Harker grinned, revealing a gap where 2 teeth should have been. "Was being the operative word. Captured him 3 days ago trying to sneak out of town. He's locked up tight in the jail cell out back." Fletcher's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You don't say." "Yep. Means you made the trip for nothing." Harker seemed to find this amusing. "Unless you want to argue about who gets the bounty?" Fletcher considered this for a moment, then shook his head. "Keep it, Sheriff. Sounds like you earned it fair and square." Harker looked startled. "That's mighty generous of you, Blackwell. That's $200 you're walking away from." Fletcher merely shrugged. "Consider it my contribution to Bisbee's law enforcement." He turned to leave, then paused. "One thing, though. I'd appreciate a look at him just to confirm it's really Wade." Harker led him to the cells at the back of the building. Sure enough, Jackson Wade sat on a narrow cot, his hands manacled, his bearded face sullen. He looked up as Fletcher approached, recognition flaring in his eyes. "Blackwell," he spat. "Should have known you'd be on my trail." "Hello, Wade," Fletcher replied calmly. "Looks like the sheriff beat me to you." Wade cursed, turning away to face the wall. Fletcher studied him for a moment, then nodded to Harker. "That's him all right. Good work, Sheriff." As he left the jail, Fletcher felt oddly unburdened. For the first time in years, he had no immediate destination, no criminal to track down. He was free to choose his next move based solely on what he wanted, not on where the next bounty would take him. And what he wanted, he realized with sudden clarity, was to see if there might be a future for him and Rosalind in Bisbee. Fletcher spent the next hour walking through the town, seeing it with new eyes. Bisbee was rough around the edges, certainly a mining town built on copper and the hard men who dug it from the earth. But there were signs of civilization taking hold. A school, several stores that catered to families, even a small lending library above the general store. He stopped at the bathhouse, paying for a proper bath and a shave. Afterward, he visited the general store, where he purchased a new shirt and had his trail clothes brushed and pressed while he waited. By the time he was done, the sun was low in the sky, and he knew the raising of the cross would be happening soon. When Fletcher returned to the church, he found a sizable crowd gathered. Word had spread throughout Bisbee about Preacher Lawson's daughter and her remarkable journey. The cross lay on the ground before the church, but it had been transformed. The bullet gouge remained, but around it, Thomas Miller and the other carpenters had carved a pattern of leaves and vines, incorporating the damage into a design that enhanced rather than detracted from the cross's beauty. Rosalind stood to one side, freshly bathed and dressed in a clean blue dress that must have belonged to Sarah Miller. Her hair was neatly arranged, and though weariness still marked her features, there was a peace about her that hadn't been there before. When she spotted Fletcher approaching, her face lit up with a smile that made his heart skip a beat. "You came back," she said as he reached her side. "I promised I would," Fletcher replied simply. Before they could say more, Thomas Miller called for attention. "Friends and neighbors," he began, his deep voice carrying across the churchyard. "Many of you helped build this church alongside our dear departed brother, Jacob Lawson. Today, we complete his vision by raising the cross his hands crafted and his daughter's determination brought to us." A murmur of appreciation ran through the crowd. Miller continued, "The journey of this cross and of Rosalind Lawson reminds us that faith is not merely words, but deeds, not just belief, but action." He gestured to Rosalind. "Would you like to say anything before we raise your father's cross?" Rosalind stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly before her. "My father believed that everyone deserves a place to seek peace, hope, and redemption. He built this church not just as a monument to God, but as a refuge for all who seek those things." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. "In carrying his cross here, I've learned what he always taught me, that burdens shared are burdens lightened, and that even the longest journey can be endured with faith and friendship. Her eyes met Fletcher's on this last word, and the warmth in her gaze told him she meant far more than mere friendship. With that, the men moved into position around the cross. 4 strong miners lifted it, while others stood ready with ropes and braces. Thomas Miller directed the operation with the expertise of a master carpenter. Slowly, the cross was raised, the base fitting perfectly into the socket that had been prepared at the peak of the church's roof. As the cross settled into place, catching the golden light of the setting sun, a spontaneous cheer went up from the crowd. Someone began to sing a hymn, and others joined in, the music swelling in the evening air. Rosalind stood watching, tears streaming unchecked down her face. Fletcher moved to her side, taking her hand in his. She turned to him, a smile breaking through her tears. "It's done," she whispered. "I kept my promise." "You did," Fletcher agreed, squeezing her hand. "Your father would be proud." As the crowd began to disperse, many stopping to introduce themselves to Rosalind and express their admiration for her journey, Sarah Miller approached them. "We're having a small gathering at our home to celebrate," she told them. "Nothing fancy, just some food and fellowship. You'll both come, of course." Fletcher glanced at Rosalind, who nodded. "We'd be honored," he replied. The Miller home was a comfortable 2-story building near the church, furnished simply but with an air of warmth and welcome. A dozen or so of Jacob Lawson's closest friends gathered there, sharing memories of the preacher and expressing their gladness at meeting his daughter. Rosalind was the center of attention, with everyone wanting to hear the story of her journey. She told it modestly, giving Fletcher more credit than he felt he deserved for his part in it. Throughout the evening, they were rarely more than an arm's length apart, their growing closeness apparent to everyone present. As the gathering wound down, Thomas Miller took Fletcher aside. "You're not just passing through, are you, Mr. Blackwell?" he asked directly. Fletcher considered the question. "I came to Bisbee on business," he admitted, "but now that business is concluded, I find myself reconsidering my plans." Miller nodded, his eyes shrewd. "Because of Rosalind?" It wasn't a question, but Fletcher answered anyway. "Yes, because of her. She's a special young woman," Miller said. "Her father thought the world of her." "As do I," Fletcher replied honestly. Miller studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "There's a place for a good man in Bisbee, if you're looking to settle. The mine's always hiring, and with your experience—" He trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. "I appreciate that," Fletcher said. "I've got some thinking to do." Across the room, Rosalind was speaking with Sarah Miller, their heads close together in earnest conversation. As if sensing Fletcher's gaze, she looked up, a smile spreading across her face when their eyes met. Later, as the stars appeared in the clear night sky, Fletcher and Rosalind found a moment alone on the Millers' small porch. "Sarah has offered me a position at the school," Rosalind said, her voice tinged with excitement, "teaching the younger children. She says they're desperately short-handed with more families moving to Bisbee all the time." "That's wonderful," Fletcher said warmly. "Will you accept?" Rosalind nodded. "Yes, I think I will. It feels right, somehow continuing my father's work in a different way." She hesitated, then asked the question that had been on her mind all evening. "And you, Fletcher? What will you do now?" Fletcher took her hands in his, turning to face her fully in the soft glow of light from the house windows. "That depends," he said. "On what?" "On whether there might be a place for me here, in Bisbee." He paused, gathering his courage. "With you." Rosalind's breath caught. "What are you saying, Fletcher?" "I'm saying that in all my years of wandering, I've never found anything worth stopping for until I met you." Fletcher's voice was low, sincere. "I'm saying that walking beside you these past days has changed me, Rosalind, made me want things I'd given up hoping for long ago." "What things?" Rosalind whispered, her eyes wide and hopeful. "A home, a purpose beyond the next bounty, someone to share my life with." Fletcher took a deep breath. "I know it's sudden. We've only known each other a short time. But sometimes Sometimes you just know when something is right. Rosalind stepped closer to him, her hands tightening around his. My father used to say that God works in mysterious ways, that sometimes he brings people together through the most unexpected circumstances. Is that what happened with us? Fletcher asked, a smile tugging at his lips. I believe it is, Rosalind replied softly. And I believe there's a place for you here, Fletcher Blackwell, if you want it. Fletcher's answer was to draw her into his arms, kissing her with all the emotion that had been building between them throughout their journey. Rosalind responded with equal fervor, her arms winding around his neck as she rose on tiptoe to meet him. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Fletcher rested his forehead against hers. I do want it, he said, more than anything. Over the next few weeks, Fletcher and Rosalind settled into life in Bisbee. Fletcher found work as a deputy to Sheriff Harker, whose appreciation for Fletcher's skills outweighed any disappointment over losing the Wade bounty. Rosalind began teaching at Sarah Miller's school, quickly winning the hearts of her young pupils with her patience and kindness. They courted properly, under the watchful but approving eyes of the Millers, who had taken Rosalind in as if she were their own daughter. Fletcher called on her at the Millers' home, took her for walks on her free afternoons, and escorted her to church services held beneath her father's cross. On Sundays, after the service, they would often visit the small cemetery on the hillside above town, where a plot had been reserved for Jacob Lawson. Though his body rested in Tucson, Rosalind had brought a small stone marker to place there, a memorial to the man whose vision had brought them together. He would have liked you, Rosalind told Fletcher on one such visit as they stood beside the marker, despite your profession, or perhaps because of it. He believed everyone had a purpose in God's plan. Even bounty hunters? Fletcher asked with a small smile. Especially those who are willing to walk beside someone in need, Rosalind replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. As spring turned to summer, Fletcher saved his deputy's wages and made plans for the future. He purchased a small piece of land on the outskirts of Bisbee, not far from the church, and with Thomas Miller's help, began building a modest home there. Building for someone in particular? Sheriff Harker asked one day, watching Fletcher head off to work on the house after his shift. Fletcher merely smiled, tipping his hat to his boss as he left. On a warm evening in August, with the house nearly complete, Fletcher took Rosalind to see the progress. The simple two-bedroom structure stood solid against the backdrop of the Mule Mountains, its wide porch offering a view of the valley below. It's beautiful, Fletcher, Rosalind said as they stood on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. You and Mr. Miller have done wonderful work. Fletcher leaned against the porch rail, watching her face as she took in the details of what he hoped would be their home. There's still finishing work to be done inside, he said. Thought you might have some ideas about that. Rosalind turned to him, curiosity in her eyes. Me? Why would my opinion matter for your home? Fletcher took her hands in his heart pounding with nervousness and hope. Because I'm hoping it will be your home too, Rosalind. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small ring. Simple but elegant, with a single small diamond that caught the last rays of the setting sun. If you'll have me as your husband, Rosalind's eyes widened, filling with tears of joy. Oh, Fletcher, she breathed. Yes, I will. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms for a kiss that promised a lifetime of love and companionship. When they broke apart, both were smiling through their tears. I never expected this, Rosalind said, looking down at the ring on her finger. When I set out from Tucson with my father's cross, I thought I was completing his journey, not beginning my own. Sometimes the end of one journey is just the beginning of another, Fletcher replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and I'm grateful beyond words that our paths crossed when they did. They were married in October, beneath the cross that had brought them together. The small church was filled to capacity with well-wishers, the Millers, Sheriff Harker, Rosalind's pupils and their parents, and many others who had come to respect the school teacher and the deputy who had found each other in such unexpected circumstances. Sarah Miller had helped Rosalind make her wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation of ivory satin that made Fletcher's breath catch when he saw her walking down the aisle toward him. Thomas Miller gave the bride away, and the local judge, who had been a friend of Jacob Lawson, performed the ceremony. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Arizona," the judge concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Mr. Blackwell, you may kiss your bride." Fletcher didn't need to be told twice. As their lips met in their first kiss as a married couple, a shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds outside, streaming through the windows to illuminate the newly wedded pair in a golden glow that many present would later describe as divinely inspired. The reception was held in the schoolyard, with tables laden with food contributed by seemingly every household in Bisbee. There was music and dancing well into the evening, the entire town celebrating the union of two people who had quickly become beloved members of the community. As dusk fell, Fletcher and Rosalind slipped away to the home they would now share as husband and wife. Standing on the porch, Fletcher swept Rosalind into his arms to carry her over the threshold. "Welcome home, Mrs. Blackwell," he said, setting her down gently in the front room that they had furnished together over the previous weeks. "Home," Rosalind repeated, looking around at the simple but comfortable space that represented the beginning of their life together. "It has such a wonderful sound to it." Fletcher drew her into his arms, his heart full of gratitude for the woman who had changed his life so completely. "I never thought I'd have this," he admitted. "A home, a wife, a place where I belong." "Nor did I after my father died," Rosalind replied softly. "I thought I was alone in the world." "Not anymore," Fletcher promised, sealing his words with a kiss that spoke of all the love and devotion he felt for her. "Never again." In the years that followed, Fletcher and Rosalind built a life together that exceeded both their dreams. Fletcher continued as deputy sheriff, eventually becoming sheriff himself when Harker retired. Rosalind taught at the school, becoming headmistress after Sarah Miller passed away. Together, they were instrumental in Bisbee's growth from a rough mining camp to a proper town, with amenities and institutions that served the growing population. Their home expanded as their family did first, with the birth of their son, Jacob Thomas Blackwell, named for Rosalind's father and Thomas Miller, and later with the arrival of twins, Sarah and Elizabeth. Fletcher built additions to the house as needed, always with the same care and craftsmanship that had gone into the original structure. The cross that had brought them together remained atop the church, weathering storms and sunshine alike, a constant reminder of the journey they had shared and the faith that had sustained them. Occasionally, Rosalind would catch Fletcher looking up at it, a thoughtful expression on his face. "What are you thinking about?" she asked him once, slipping her arm through his as they left a Sunday service. Fletcher smiled down at her, the lines around his eyes crinkling with affection. "About how a man can spend years wandering without direction, only to find his true path when he decides to walk beside a determined woman and her father's cross." Rosalind returned his smile, her heart as full of love for him as it had been on their wedding day. "I'm glad you decided to walk beside me, Fletcher Blackwell." "Best decision I ever made," he replied, pulling her close, "and one I've never regretted, not for a single day." Together they walked home, surrounded by their children, their steps in perfect unison, just as they had been since that fateful day when a bounty hunter decided to help a grief-stricken daughter fulfill her promise and found his own redemption in the process.